The 4-year-old twins moved as one. Leo's small hands seized the lunar crown from Lady Isidora's elaborately pinned hair, while his sister Lyanna caught it before it could fall. The entire Ironclaw pack, along with visiting dignitaries from 3 neighboring territories, watched in paralyzed silence as the ancient silver circlet, untouched by common hands for 5 centuries, hung suspended between 2 golden-haired children who should have been celebrating their new mother. Alpha Silas Vane stood frozen at the altar, his ceremonial robes suddenly feeling like chains. The crown had never been rejected. Not in the entire documented history of the Ironclaw bloodline. Not once. But Leo and Lyanna weren't throwing a tantrum. Their movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. They climbed down from the dais with the crown held between them like a sacred offering, their bare feet padding across the cold cathedral stone. The pack elders gasped. Lady Isidora's perfectly composed face cracked with fury. The twins walked past their father, past the sputtering priestess, past rows of horrified nobles, straight toward the shadowed corner where the Omega servants stood. They stopped before a trembling girl with silver hair that caught the candlelight like moonbeams, her hands still stained with lye from the morning's laundry. Her threadbare dress marked her as beneath notice, yet the children raised the crown with absolute certainty. When they placed it on Lyra's head, the tarnished metal erupted in blinding celestial light. The dull silver that hadn't gleamed in living memory suddenly blazed with the radiance of a full moon, casting dancing shadows across the vaulted ceiling. Lyra stumbled backward, but the crown remained perfectly balanced, as if it had finally found its true home after centuries of waiting. Silas felt his carefully constructed world shatter in that impossible moment. If you want to discover how a widowed Alpha and an invisible Omega become the family his pack truly needs, keep reading, because what happens next will challenge everything you believe about destiny, duty, and the wisdom children possess that adults have forgotten. Hit subscribe, and comment where you are reading from. I'd love to know where you're reading from, so I can send you a hug of strength for this journey. You're going to need it. Let me take you back 6 months before that sacred ceremony. Back to when Alpha Silas Vane was drowning in responsibility and grief. Back to when he believed a strategic marriage was the only way to secure his pack's future and give his wild, heartbroken children the stability they desperately needed. Back to when he couldn't see that the answer to his family's healing was already living in the cold stone rooms beneath his feet, washing sheets and singing lullabies to herself in the dark. 6 months earlier, Alpha Silas Vane sat in the war room long after the council had dismissed themselves, staring at reports he could no longer focus on. The numbers blurred together: grain stores, border patrols, treaty negotiations, all demanding his attention while his children screamed in the nursery 3 floors above. He could hear them even here, their voices carrying through the stone corridors like accusations. He'd been hearing Elara's voice too lately, soft and disappointed in the spaces between his thoughts. "This isn't what I asked of you," she seemed to whisper. "I asked you to love them, not manage them." But Elara had been dead for 2 years, and the dead had the luxury of judging without offering solutions. She'd left him with golden-haired tornadoes who broke everything they touched and a pack that watched his every move, waiting for him to prove he could be both alpha and father. He was failing spectacularly at the latter. The nursery door slammed open somewhere above, followed by the crash of something expensive shattering. That would be the 3rd governess this month. Silas closed his eyes and counted to 10 in the old tongue, the way his own father had taught him to master his wolf before it mastered him. It didn't help. When he finally climbed the stairs, he found Leo and Lyanna covered in paint. Where had they even found paint? Having apparently decided the pristine nursery walls needed a mural of wolves hunting under a crimson moon. The governess, a stern woman from the Northern Ridge Pack, stood in the doorway with her bags already packed. "They're feral, Alpha," she said flatly. "With respect, they need discipline you're unwilling to provide. Or unable to." She didn't wait for a response before sweeping past him, her footsteps echoing her judgment with each click against stone. Silas looked at his children. Leo's chin jutted out defiantly, but his eyes were wet. Lyanna clutched her brother's hand, paint smeared across her cheek like war markings. They looked exactly like Elara when she'd been caught doing something reckless, that same mixture of pride and fear, daring him to see them. He was so tired of being feared by the 2 people he loved most. "It's a good mural," he finally said, his voice rough. "But next time, ask first." Leo's defiance crumbled into confusion. "You're not angry?" Silas knelt in the paint, ruining his formal trousers, and pulled them both against his chest. They smelled like turpentine and maple syrup and the lavender soap Alara had always used. They felt small and breakable and utterly beyond his ability to protect from the world that was already judging them for not being perfect alpha heirs. "I'm exhausted," he admitted. "And I don't know what I'm doing." Lionel's small hand patted his bearded cheek with the grave sincerity only 4-year-olds possess. "Mama said that's when you're supposed to ask for help." But there was no one left to ask. The elders wanted him to remarry for political advantage. The pack wanted stability. His children wanted their mother back. And Silas wanted to stop feeling like he was disappointing ghosts. The next morning, Elder Miriam cornered him after dawn patrol with a leather portfolio containing profiles of eligible highborn females. Lady Isadora's portrait sat on top, her dark eyes assessing even in miniature, her bloodline impeccable. "The pack needs a Luna," Miriam said. "Your children need a mother. And you, Alpha, need to stop pretending you can do this alone." Silas took the portfolio because refusing would be seen as weakness. Because maybe everyone else was right and he was wrong. Because Leo had bitten a visiting dignitary's son yesterday and Lionel had stopped speaking entirely except to her brother, and he had no idea how to reach them anymore. He told himself it was practical. Strategic. The responsible choice. He didn't notice the way his children's laughter had already started to fade, replaced by a watchful silence that made them seem far older than their years. Lady Isadora Blackthorne arrived on a crystalline autumn morning in a carriage that cost more than most pack members earned in a lifetime. She stepped onto the Ironclaw courtyard like she was already measuring it for renovations, her emerald traveling gown spotless despite the 3-day journey, her posture so rigid it made Silas's spine ache just looking at her. She was perfect. Devastatingly so. Educated at the Continental Academy, fluent in 5 languages, trained in pack diplomacy and resource management. Her father controlled the richest mining territories in the northern regions, and her brother commanded the second-largest military force outside the royal pack. An alliance with the Blackthorne family would secure the Ironclaw's borders for a generation. Elder Miriam practically glowed with approval as she listed Isadora's accomplishments during the formal introduction. Silas nodded at appropriate intervals, trying to feel something beyond exhausted resignation. "And these must be the young heirs," Isadora said, her voice cultured and completely devoid of warmth. She regarded Leo and Lionel the way one might assess livestock at market, a necessary component of the arrangement, but hardly the main attraction. Leo, freshly scrubbed and stuffed into formal clothes he hated, stepped forward with his hand extended the way Silas had taught him. "I'm Leo. That's Lionel. She doesn't talk to strangers." Isadora's smile didn't reach her eyes. She clasped her hands behind her back, making no move to accept the child's offered greeting. "How spirited. I'm sure we'll establish appropriate boundaries once I'm settled." The word boundaries landed like a slap. Leo's hand dropped. Lionel pressed closer to her brother, her earlier bravery evaporating. "Therefore," Silas heard himself say, sharper than intended. "Precisely why structure is so important." Isadora turned her attention back to him, dismissing the children entirely. "Alpha Silas, perhaps we could discuss the merger terms in private? I have several proposals regarding pack reorganization that I believe you'll find advantageous." She swept past him toward the manor, already speaking about trade routes and elder council reforms, and Silas found himself following like he was the guest in his own home. Behind him, he heard Leo's small voice crack with confusion. "Papa? Is she going to be our new mama?" He should have stopped. Should have turned around and gathered them close and explained that adults sometimes make difficult choices for complicated reasons. Instead, he kept walking, telling himself that the children would adjust, that Isadora would soften once she understood them, that love wasn't a prerequisite for a successful political alliance. Over the next 3 weeks, Isadora transformed his home into a campaign headquarters for her vision of the Ironclaw Pack's future. She took meals in the study, surrounded by maps and census reports. She attended council meetings and impressed the elders with her grasp of agricultural reform. She was brilliant, efficient, and utterly remote. She never once asked about the children. When Leo tried to show her a drawing he'd made, wolves playing under stars, she glanced at it for exactly 2 seconds before returning to her correspondence. Very nice. Please don't interrupt when adults are working. When Lionel finally spoke after days of silence, offering Isadora a wildflower she'd picked from the garden, the lady accepted it with 2 fingers like it might contaminate her, then set it aside and forgot it existed. The flower wilted on the windowsill, brown and curled, a perfect metaphor for whatever hope had briefly bloomed in his daughter's eyes. Silas watched it all happen and said nothing, because what could he say? That he'd chosen strategy over warmth? That he was trading his children's happiness for political security? That he was becoming exactly the kind of alpha his father had been, respected, feared, and completely alone? The twins stopped trying to engage with Isadora after that. They became ghosts in their own home, vanishing whenever she entered a room, their earlier wildness replaced with something far more concerning. Perfect, silent obedience born from understanding they were unwanted. Silas told himself they were simply adjusting to change. He didn't let himself consider what it meant that his children had learned to disappear. Lyra had been invisible for so long that she'd almost convinced herself it was a mercy. In the pre-dawn darkness of the laundry rooms, 3 levels below the manor's glittering state apartments, she could pretend the silver hair that marked her as different didn't matter. Down here, in the cold stone chambers that smelled perpetually of lye and lavender soap, rank meant nothing because everyone was equally forgotten. She'd been 5 when the traveling healer had examined her and delivered the verdict that sentenced her to this half-life, Omega. The lowest designation in the pack hierarchy, below even the servants who at least had beta blood running through their veins. Her parents, decent people, kind people, had wept as they'd handed her over to the manor's household staff. Omegas couldn't be kept in family homes. It wasn't proper. It upset the natural order. Lyra barely remembered their faces now. The other servants called her the Silver Ghost, when they thought she couldn't hear, though whether it was because of her pale hair or her ability to move through rooms unnoticed, she'd never been sure. Probably both. Her hair caught moonlight and candlelight in ways that should have been beautiful, but instead marked her as fundamentally wrong. Silver hair appeared maybe once in a generation, always on Omegas, and the superstitious whispered it meant the moon goddess was either blessing you or testing the pack's mercy. Lyra had found very little mercy. Her dress, she only owned 2, rotating them on washing days, had been patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible beneath the repairs. The hem dragged because it had been made for someone taller, someone who'd died of fever 3 winters ago, and no one had bothered to alter it for the scrawny girl who'd inherited it. Her hands were raw and reddened from the harsh soap, her fingernails permanently stained no matter how hard she scrubbed. But she kept her spine straight. It was the one thing they couldn't take from her, the quiet dignity her mother had whispered about in those last moments before the separation. "You are not your rank," her mother had said, pressing a kiss to her silver hair. "You are your choices." So Lyra chose to be kind when the world offered her nothing but cruelty. She chose to hum old ballads while she worked, filling the cold stones with something resembling warmth. She chose to fold each sheet with care, to mend each torn pillowcase as if it mattered, because the alternative was letting the bitterness consume her the way it had consumed other Omegas she'd watched grow old in these rooms. The work was endless. Sheets from 50 beds, tablecloths from state dinners, the delicate garments of visiting nobles who would recoil if they knew Omega hands had touched their clothes. She scrubbed and rinsed and wrung until her shoulders ached and her fingers cramped, then hung everything in the drying rooms where weak sunlight filtered through high, narrow windows that showed only sky, never ground, never freedom. Sometimes she caught glimpses of the pack's real life happening in the world above. Footsteps on the stairs, laughter echoing down corridors, the sound of children playing in gardens she'd never be allowed to walk through. She'd learned not to want things that weren't meant for her. But lately, she'd been hearing different sounds. Children crying in the East Wing, their sobs muffled but persistent. A little girl's voice calling for her mama, the word dissolving into heartbroken silence. A little boy's anger, sharp and scared, demanding to know why nobody loved them anymore. Lyra's hands would still in the wash water when she heard them, her heart clenching with a longing she had no right to feel. She wanted to tell them they weren't alone, that someone heard them, that their pain mattered even if no one else seemed to notice. But Omegas didn't approach the Alpha's children. That was crossing a boundary that could get her cast out entirely, and she had nowhere else to go. The Ironclaw pack was the only home she'd ever known, even if home meant cold stones and chemical burns and the peculiar loneliness of being surrounded by people who looked through you like glass. So she kept her head down, her voice soft, her presence minimal. She was the silver ghost, after all, haunting the edges of other people's lives without ever truly living her own. The proposal came during breakfast in the formal dining room, delivered with the same clinical precision Isadora applied to everything. She set down her teacup with a delicate clink that somehow sounded like a gavel striking. The children need proper discipline, she announced, as if Leo and Lionel weren't sitting 20 feet away at the nursery table, pushing eggs around their plates. The Silvercrest Military Academy accepts students as young as 4. It would be ideal. Silas's fork paused halfway to his mouth. They're too young for boarding school. They're exactly the right age for structure. Isadora unfolded a letter she'd apparently already drafted, her efficiency both impressive and deeply unsettling. I've taken the liberty of corresponding with Commandant Thorne. He's agreed to evaluate them next month. The Academy has produced exceptional alphas for 3 generations. Your children would benefit immensely from. No. The word came out harder than Silas intended. Isadora's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. You haven't heard the full proposal. I don't need to. They just lost their mother 2 years ago. I'm not sending them away. Alpha Silas. Her voice dropped into the patient tone one used with difficult children. Your emotional attachment is understandable, but it's clouding your judgment. The twins are, forgive my bluntness, feral. They've driven away 6 governesses. They refuse to attend lessons. Yesterday, Leo bit elder Thaddeus's grandson, and Lionel still barely speaks. This isn't normal adjustment to loss. This is behavioral dysfunction that requires professional intervention. Everything she said was technically true, which made it impossible to argue against without sounding irrational. Silas looked across the room at his children. They'd gone utterly still, the way prey animals froze when predators circled. Leo's small hand found Lionel's under the table. They'd heard every word. Perhaps we could discuss this privately, Silas said quietly. Why? This concerns their future. They should understand that actions have consequences. Isadora stood, smoothing her morning gown with the air of someone who'd already won the argument. Silvercrest would teach them discipline, respect, and proper pack hierarchy. They'd return for holidays, naturally. But daily life under military structure would transform them into the heirs the Ironclaw pack deserves, rather than the wild creatures they're currently becoming. Wild creatures. As if his children were problems to be solved rather than souls to be healed. But doubt crept in, insidious and familiar. What if she was right? What if his grief and guilt were making him too soft, too permissive? His own father had believed in harsh discipline, and Silas had grown into a strong alpha. The pack was watching, judging, whispering about whether he could control his own household. Maybe sending them away was the responsible choice. The difficult choice that proved he could put pack stability ahead of personal feelings. I'll consider it, he heard himself say, and hated the relief in Elder Miriam's eyes as she nodded approval from the doorway. Lionel's fork clattered to her plate. She slid from her chair and ran from the room, her footsteps echoing her retreat. Leo followed without a word, his young face carved with betrayal so profound it made Silas's chest ache. He should have gone after them. Should have pulled them close and promised he'd never send them away, that they were more important than politics or propriety or Isadora's plans for pack reorganization. Instead, he sat in the formal dining room listening to Isadora outline the Academy's curriculum. Combat training, pack law, strategic thinking, and tried to convince himself this was what good fathers did. Made hard choices. Prepared their children for brutal worlds. Loved them enough to let them go. The library was where they found refuge, wedged behind the oversized atlas that no one had moved in years. Leo held his sister while she cried silently into his shoulder, her small body shaking. He didn't cry himself. He'd stopped crying weeks ago, right around when he'd realized the pretty lady with cold eyes wasn't going to love them no matter how good they were. He's going to send us away, Lionel whispered, the first words she'd spoken in 3 days. Leo tightened his arms around her. No, Papa wouldn't. But his voice carried no conviction, and they both knew it. They'd been listening to adult conversations they weren't supposed to hear, watching their father disappear behind polite masks and duty, feeling themselves becoming inconvenient obstacles to something bigger and more important than their small, broken hearts. I want Mama, Lionel said, and Leo wanted to tell her Mama was in the moon goddess's garden watching over them, the way the old stories promised. But he'd stopped believing in stories too. Me too, he admitted instead, and they stayed hidden behind the atlas until dusk painted the windows purple, waiting for someone to come find them. No one did. They found the laundry rooms by accident, following the sound of humming through corridors they'd never explored. Leo had been looking for a place farther away, somewhere no one would think to search when they realized the heirs were missing again. Lionel held his hand so tightly it hurt, but he didn't tell her to let go. The stone steps led down and down, growing colder with each descent, until they reached a level of the manor that smelled like soap and steam. The humming grew clearer, a woman's voice, soft and melodic, singing words in the old tongue that Leo half remembered from his mother's bedtime songs. They peered around the doorframe and saw her. The silver-haired girl stood at a massive wooden basin, her arms submerged to the elbows in grey water, her patched dress hanging loose on her thin frame. But her hair caught the lamplight like moonbeams, shimmering with each movement, and something about the set of her shoulders, straight despite the obvious weight of her work, made Leo think of the wolves in his favorite storybook. Dignified even in captivity. She must have sensed them watching because she turned, her eyes widening. They were pale gray, almost silver like her hair, and they filled with immediate concern rather than the irritation they'd learned to expect from adults. Oh, she breathed, setting down the sheet she'd been wringing. You shouldn't be down here. If someone finds you. We don't care, Leo said, chin jutting forward defensively. Nobody cares where we are anyway. Something flickered across her face. Recognition, perhaps, of a loneliness that mirrored her own. She glanced toward the stairs, then back at them, clearly weighing risks Leo didn't understand. Finally, she wiped her hands on her apron and crouched to their level. Are you hungry? She asked gently. Lionel nodded, and Lyra disappeared into a small alcove, returning with half a honey roll wrapped in cloth and a somewhat bruised apple. It's not much. Just my lunch. But you can share it. They devoured the food like they hadn't eaten in days, even though they'd walked away from a full breakfast. Somehow this tasted better. Maybe because it was freely given, or maybe because the silver-haired girl watched them with softness instead of calculation. What's your name? Lionel asked, her voice small but present. Lyra. She smiled, and it transformed her entire face. And you're Leo and Lionel. I've heard you playing sometimes, when I'm working. Your laughter carries down here. We don't laugh anymore, Leo said matter-of-factly. Lyra's smile faltered. No, she agreed quietly. I suppose you don't. She settled onto the floor cross-legged, her skirts pooling around her. Would you like to hear a story while I work? I can't stop washing, these sheets need to be done by evening, but you could stay if you'd like. They stayed. Lyra told them about the moon goddess, how she'd created the first wolves from starlight and shadow, how she watched over every pack member regardless of their rank. Her voice painted pictures more vivid than any book. Silver forests where the trees sang, celestial wolves that ran across the night sky leaving trails of stardust, a goddess who loved her children too much to ever abandon them. Even omegas? Lionel asked, and Lyra's hands stilled in the water. Especially omegas, she said softly. The moon goddess sees hearts, not ranks. She knows that sometimes the strongest souls are placed in the smallest bodies, the wisest spirits in the lowest stations. It's her way of testing whether we're paying attention. Leo didn't know if he believed in the moon goddess anymore, but he believed in Lyra. In the way she let them fold washcloths while she told stories, never rushing them or sighing with impatience. In how she taught them the words to her old tongue songs, her voice blending with theirs until the cold stone room felt almost warm. In the way she listened when they finally, haltingly, told her about their mother and the pretty lady who wanted to send them away and how their papa had stopped seeing them. She didn't offer false comfort or empty promises. She just pulled them close, her damp sleeves leaving wet marks on their shoulders, and said, "I see you. Both of you. And you matter." It was the first time in months that either twin had felt real. They returned the next day, and the next, always in the afternoon when Isadora was occupied with council meetings and their father was reviewing border reports. The laundry rooms became their sanctuary, Lyra their secret. She taught them how to sort linens by color and weight, how to hang sheets so they dried without wrinkles, how to mend small tears with tiny, almost invisible stitches. "My mother taught me this," she told them, guiding Lionel's small fingers through the motion. She said, "Every repair tells a story. This cloth was broken, but now it's whole again. Different than before, maybe, with the scar still visible. But whole." Leo understood she wasn't just talking about fabric. They never told anyone about their afternoons in the cold basement rooms with the silver ghost who made them feel less alone. It was their secret, precious and fragile, the one good thing in a world that seemed determined to break them further. Lyra never asked them to keep quiet. She simply understood, the way she seemed to understand everything about loneliness and survival and finding light in dark places. And when Lionel finally laughed again, really laughed bright and startled, when Leo got tangled in a sheet and fell over, Lyra's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. Above them, the manor continued its preparations for a wedding that would seal the twins' fate. But 3 levels below, in rooms no one important ever visited, a broken Omega and 2 grieving children were slowly stitching themselves back together. Silas found them by following the sound he'd almost forgotten existed. His children's laughter, bright and unrestrained, echoing from the kitchen gardens behind the servant quarters. He'd been searching for an hour, his worry transmuting into the cold anger of a father whose children kept vanishing, when the sound stopped him mid-stride. Leo was laughing. Actually laughing, the kind of full-belly joy that Silas hadn't heard since before Elara died. He moved quietly toward the sound, some instinct telling him to observe before announcing his presence. The kitchen gardens were meant for growing herbs and vegetables for the staff meals, a utilitarian plot that the nobles never visited. Which explained why no one had reported what he now saw. His children were covered in mud. Absolutely filthy, their formal clothes Isadora had insisted they wear at all times, transformed into brown-smeared rags. They knelt in the dirt beside a silver-haired girl he didn't recognize, all 3 of them digging holes with their bare hands and laughing like it was the finest entertainment in the world. "No, Leo, deeper," the girl was saying, her voice warm with amusement. "The roots need room to spread, or the plant will be sad and cramped." "Plants have feelings?" Lionel asked, her voice clear and curious. Not the whisper she'd adopted around Isadora, but her real voice, the one Silas had thought he'd lost forever. "Of course they do." The silver-haired girl sat back on her heels, her patched dress as mud-stained as the twins' clothes. "Everything that grows has feelings. That's why we have to be gentle when we move them. We're asking them to trust us with their lives." Leo planted a small herb seedling with exaggerated care, his tongue poking out in concentration. "Like this. Perfect." The girl's smile was radiant, transforming her thin face into something almost luminous. "You're a natural gardener, Leo. And Lionel, look how straight your row is. Your mother would be proud." Silas's breath caught. No one mentioned Elara anymore. Everyone tiptoed around her memory like it might shatter him, might shatter the children. But this stranger spoke of her naturally, keeping her present instead of erasing her, and his children didn't flinch or cry. They smiled, sad but real, acknowledging the mother they'd loved. "Mama liked gardens," Lionel said softly. "She had roses. Pink ones." "Then we should plant roses next," the girl replied. "In her honor. Would you like that?" Both children nodded, and Silas watched his daughter lean against the silver-haired stranger's shoulder with unconscious trust that sent a sharp pang through his chest. When had Lionel last sought comfort from anyone? When had Leo's defenses dropped enough to allow himself to be a child instead of a tiny, angry warrior? "Lyra, can you tell us the story about the wolf and the moon again?" Leo asked, and the name registered in Silas's mind. Lyra, one of the Omega servants, he thought. He'd never paid attention to the household staff beyond approving their wages. She launched into a tale about a wolf who fell in love with the moon and learned to howl to bridge the distance between earth and sky, her voice lilting with the natural storyteller's rhythm. The twins listened, rapt, occasionally interrupting with questions she answered with patience and genuine interest. This was what he'd been missing. Not in his children, in himself. The ability to simply be present without calculating political ramifications or worrying about pack perception. The willingness to get dirty, to be silly, to treat children like people whose emotions mattered rather than small alphas who needed to be molded into proper shapes. Isadora would be horrified by this scene. She'd see disorder, impropriety, and Omega overstepping boundaries by fraternizing with heirs. She'd want the girl dismissed, the children scrubbed clean, the whole incident forgotten and never repeated. Silas found he didn't care what Isadora thought. He must have made some sound because Lyra's head snapped up, her silver eyes going wide with fear. She scrambled to her feet, nearly tripping over her skirts, her body language screaming of someone expecting punishment. "Alpha," she breathed, dropping into a submissive posture that made something twist uncomfortably in Silas's gut. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to, they were upset, and I only thought to. I'll go immediately. Please don't. Papa." Leo launched himself forward, muddy hands and all, wrapping around Silas's leg. "Don't be mad at Lyra. She's teaching us about growing things and telling us about Mama, and she's nice, Papa, she's so nice." Lyanna appeared on his other side, her small hand finding his. "Please don't send her away," she whispered. "We'll be good. We promise." They thought he'd come to punish this girl who'd somehow accomplished what 6 trained governesses and a future Luna couldn't. She'd made his children feel safe enough to laugh again. Silas knelt in the dirt, ruining his formal trousers for the second time in a month, and met the Omega's frightened gaze. "What's your full name?" "Lyra, Alpha. Just Lyra. Omegas don't keep family names." "Lyra." He tasted the name, saw how his children's hands tightened protectively around hers. "Thank you for caring for my children. I haven't heard them laugh like that in a very long time." Her fear didn't fully dissipate, but confusion joined it. "You're not angry?" "No. And he meant it. I'm grateful." He stayed in the garden for another hour, watching Lyra teach his children the names of herbs and the proper way to water seedlings without drowning them. He didn't participate, his presence made her too nervous, but he witnessed something he'd thought impossible, his children being children again, messy and joyful and holy, beautifully alive. When he finally led them back to the manor, both twins talking over each other about moon gardens and wolf packs and could they please plant roses for Mama, Silas caught Lyra watching from the garden gate. She looked terrified and hopeful in equal measure, like she expected this fragile permission to be revoked at any moment. He nodded to her, a small acknowledgement, and something in her posture relaxed. That night, as he listened to Isadora's latest reorganization plans, Silas found his mind wandering back to muddy hands and silver hair and the sound of his children laughing. He found himself wondering what kind of man chose political advantage over the people who'd somehow given his family back its heart. Lyra had been delivering fresh linens to the East Wing when she heard the voices drifting from Lady Isadora's temporary study. She should have kept walking. Omegas who eavesdropped on nobles rarely lived to regret it. But something in the cold precision of Isadora's tone made her pause, her arms full of folded sheets, her feet refusing to carry her past the half-open door. "The Omega situation is untenable," Isadora was saying, her voice crisp with aristocratic disdain. "I've reviewed the household records. We're housing and feeding 23 Omegas who contribute minimal value to pack operations. It's inefficient and, frankly, beneath the Ironclaw's station." Elder Miriam's response was cautious. "The Omegas serve essential functions. Laundry, kitchen work, general maintenance. Functions that could be outsourced to neighboring packs for a fraction of the cost." Papers rustled, the sound of documents being arranged. "Once I'm Luna, I intend to implement a comprehensive purification initiative. We'll phase out the Omega housing entirely. Those who wish to remain in Ironclaw territory can find employment in the outer villages, but they won't reside in the manor. It's degrading to have them underfoot." Lyra's hands tightened on the linens, her knuckles white. The outer villages had no housing for displaced Omegas. No work that paid enough to survive. Isadora wasn't talking about relocation. She was talking about exile disguised as efficiency. That's quite ambitious, another voice joined, Elder Thaddeus, his tone approving. Though I imagine Alpha Silas might have concerns about such drastic changes. Isadora's laugh was crystalline and utterly without warmth. Silas will see reason once I provide the financial projections. He's a pragmatist, despite his recent sentimentality. Which brings me to the matter of the children. Lyra's breath stopped. The twins are damaged goods, I'm afraid. Too wild, too attached to their dead mother's memory. That silver-haired Omega hasn't helped, filling their heads with fairy tales and encouraging their disobedience. I caught them covered in mud yesterday, playing servant games in the kitchen gardens like common urchins. Children can be redirected, Elder Miriam offered carefully. Not these children. Not at this age, with this degree of behavioral dysfunction. Isadora's voice dropped into something colder, more calculated. Silvercrest Academy remains the optimal solution. Once they're away, properly disciplined, properly educated, they'll return as acceptable heirs. If they don't adapt to the structure. She paused meaningfully. Well, accidents happen at military academies. Training exercises gone wrong. Unfortunate but not unheard of. The casual cruelty of it struck Lyra like a physical blow. Isadora was discussing the potential death of 4-year-old children with the same detachment one might use to discuss culling weak livestock. You can't mean, Elder Thaddeus sounded genuinely shocked. I mean that I will provide the Ironclaw pack with proper heirs. My heirs. Children raised from birth to understand pack hierarchy, unspoiled by grief and permissive parenting. Silas is still young enough to father a new family. One that reflects the pack's future rather than clinging to its tragic past. And if the twins survive the academy? Miriam asked quietly. Then they can remain there permanently. As military officers, perhaps, serving the pack from a safe distance. But they will not return to the manor while I'm Luna. I won't have my children exposed to their instability. The bloodline will continue through my heirs, not Alara's broken leftovers. Lyra had heard enough. She backed away from the door on trembling legs, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. The linens slipped from her nerveless fingers, tumbling to the corridor floor in a cascade of white, but she couldn't stop to retrieve them. She had to think. Had to breathe. Had to figure out what to do with information that could destroy her if she spoke but destroy Leo and Lyanna if she stayed silent. She stumbled down the servants' stairs, her vision blurring, and barely made it to the laundry rooms before her knees gave out. She sank onto the cold stone floor, her mind racing through impossible scenarios. Who could she tell? Who would believe an Omega's word against a highborn lady's? Who would care that the future Luna was planning to systematically erase everything the late Luna had left behind? The Alpha. She had to tell Alpha Silas. He'd looked at his children in the garden with such longing, such regret. He'd thanked her for making them laugh. Surely he wouldn't knowingly marry a woman who referred to his children as broken leftovers, and plotted their exile or worse. But doubt crept in, insidious and familiar. He was already considering sending them to Silvercrest. He'd chosen Isadora knowing she was cold toward the twins. Maybe he wanted them gone. Maybe Isadora was simply saying aloud what Silas already believed, that his children were problems to be solved, obstacles to overcome, reminders of a past he needed to leave behind. Lyra pressed her hands against her face, her raw fingers smelling of lye and lavender. She thought about Leo's gap-toothed smile when he successfully planted a seedling. About Lyanna's quiet voice asking if the moon goddess really loved Omegas too. About 2 small bodies curled against her sides while she told stories, trusting her completely because no one else had offered them safety. She couldn't let them be sent away to a place where accidents happen. She couldn't stand by while their father married a woman who saw them as inconveniences to be eliminated. But she was just an Omega. Invisible. Powerless. Speaking against Lady Isadora would mean her own exile, possibly her death. Yet staying silent would mean abandoning the only 2 people who'd ever made her feel like she mattered. Lyra pulled herself to her feet, her decision crystallizing with the cold clarity of someone who'd already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. She would tell the Alpha what she'd heard. She would give him the truth and pray to the moon goddess that somewhere beneath the duty and grief, there was still a father who loved his children more than he feared political consequences. And if he chose Isadora anyway, if he sent his children away knowing what awaited them, then at least Lyra would know she'd tried. At least she could live with herself in whatever outer village or distant pack would take in a silver-haired Omega with nowhere else to go. She smoothed her patched dress, braided her silver hair with trembling fingers, and began the long walk up 3 floors to the Alpha's private study. Above her, the manor prepared for a wedding. But in the cold basement rooms, an Omega who'd been invisible her entire life was about to step into the light and risk everything for 2 children who'd taught her that some things, love, loyalty, the fierce protection of innocence, mattered more than survival. Which brought them back to this moment. This impossible, cathedral-shattering moment when Leo and Lyanna placed the ancient lunar crown on Lyra's silver head and the world held its breath. Silas had heard Lyra's confession 3 days after she'd climbed those stairs to his study, her voice shaking but steady as she'd repeated every word of Isadora's plan. He'd wanted to dismiss it as jealousy, as an Omega's desperate attempt to sabotage a noble match. But then he'd confronted Isadora privately, and she hadn't denied it. She'd simply raised one perfect eyebrow and asked if he was truly going to let sentiment override strategic necessity. He'd ended the engagement that night. The pack elders had been furious. Isadora's family had threatened to withdraw their alliance entirely. But Silas had looked at his children sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. Lyra had been singing them lullabies again, he'd learned, and decided he'd rather face political isolation than live knowing he'd sacrificed his children's lives for territory and trade agreements. The elders had insisted the coronation ceremony proceed anyway. A new Luna would be chosen from among acceptable candidates, they'd declared. The pack needed stability. The ancient ritual would continue as planned. No one had anticipated what Leo and Lyanna would do. Now, as the crown blazed with celestial light on Lyra's head, light that hadn't shone in 500 years, light that confirmed the moon goddess's choice beyond any possible doubt, Silas felt the final pieces of his carefully controlled world shatter and reform into something he'd never imagined. Lyra stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, the crown sitting on her silver hair like it had been forged specifically for her. The light emanated from the ancient metal itself, casting the entire cathedral in silver-blue radiance that made every witness shield their eyes. It was the sign the ancient text spoke of, the divine confirmation that appeared only when the true Luna stood before her pack. And she was an Omega. An invisible servant girl with patched dresses and lie-stained hands who'd shown his children more love in a few weeks than he'd managed to give them in 2 years of grief. The priestess recovered first, her voice cracking with awe. The moon goddess has spoken. The crown has chosen. Elder Miriam looked like she might collapse. Elder Thaddeus's face had gone purple with outrage. The visiting dignitaries whispered frantically among themselves. Isadora, who'd remained for the ceremony out of pure spite, Silas suspected, stood rigid with fury so intense it made the air around her seem to vibrate. But Leo and Lyanna looked triumphant. They stood on either side of Lyra, each holding one of her trembling hands, their small faces fierce with protective devotion. The moon goddess chose her, Leo announced to the stunned assembly, his 4-year-old voice carrying with surprising authority. We just helped her say it out loud. Lyanna nodded solemnly. Lyra's our real mother now. The goddess said so with the light. Silas found himself moving without conscious thought, climbing down from the dais where he'd stood frozen, walking across the marble floor toward the 3 figures haloed in celestial radiance. Every eye in the cathedral tracked his movement. Every breath seemed suspended, waiting to see if the Alpha would accept or reject the divine mandate that had just rewritten pack law. He stopped before Lyra, saw the terror and hope warring in her silver eyes. She expected rejection, he realized. Expected him to denounce this as some trick, some mistake, to strip the crown from her head and restore proper order. Instead, Silas knelt. The cathedral erupted in shocked gasps. An Alpha never knelt. Not to anyone except the moon goddess herself. Forgive me, he said quietly, his voice meant for Lyra alone but carrying in the sudden silence. For not seeing what my children understood immediately. For almost choosing duty over love. For being so lost in my own grief that I couldn't recognize the person who was healing theirs. Lyra's hands shook violently. Alpha, I can't possibly be. I'm just an Omega who tells stories and folds sheets. I don't know how to be a Luna. You already are one. He gestured to Leo and Lyanna, who watched with fierce approval. They knew. The crown knew. The moon goddess knew. I was the only fool who couldn't see it. He stood slowly, held out his hand palm up in the traditional gesture of offering. Not commanding. Not demanding. Asking. I'm not promising you an easy life, he said, pitching his voice to Kerry now, letting the entire pack hear. The elders will fight this. Other packs will question it. You'll face prejudice and doubt from people who can't see past rank to recognize worth. But if you're willing, if you can forgive me for my blindness and help me be the father my children deserve, then I'm asking you to be our Luna. Not because the crown chose you, though it did. But because my children love you, and I'm beginning to suspect they're wiser than I've ever been. Lyra looked at the twins, who nodded encouragement. She looked at the crown still blazing on her head, the physical manifestation of divine will. She looked at Silas's outstretched hand, weathered and scarred from 100 battles, waiting patiently for her decision. I don't know the formal ceremonies, she whispered. I don't know pack politics or diplomacy or... We'll learn together, Silas said. All of us. As a family. She placed her hand in his, her fingers rough from years of labor, her grip uncertain but real. The crown's light pulsed once, blindingly bright, then settled into a steady glow that would continue burning as long as she wore it, the visible proof that the moon goddess approved not just of Lyra, but of the family they were choosing to become. Leo and Lyanna wrapped themselves around their legs, a tangle of children and adults and hope. In the back of the cathedral, Elder Miriam finally bowed her head in acceptance. It spread like a wave through the assembled packs, some reluctant, some awed, but all acknowledging what couldn't be denied. The Silver Ghost had become their Luna, and the Ironclaw pack would never be the same. 6 months after the coronation that rewrote pack history, Silas found Lyra in the garden she'd transformed from utilitarian plot to sanctuary. The moon hung full and heavy above them, painting everything silver, her hair, the roses she'd planted in Alara's memory, the simple cotton dress she still preferred over the elaborate gowns the pack had commissioned for their unlikely Luna. She was humming, that same old-tongue melody he'd first heard echoing from the laundry rooms, while she tied back rose vines that had grown wild with summer abundance. She didn't hear him approach, too absorbed in her work, and Silas took a moment to simply watch her. To marvel at how this silver-haired girl who'd been invisible 6 months ago now commanded pack councils with quiet authority, settled disputes with patient wisdom, and somehow made every Omega in the territory feel seen for the first time in their lives. The pack had resisted at first. Elder Thaddeus had resigned in protest. 3 noble families had withdrawn from the alliance network. But slowly, grudgingly, they'd begun to notice what Silas had seen from that first moment in the kitchen garden. Lyra led with her heart, and hearts were harder to dismiss than hierarchy. She'd established schools for Omega children. Revised the labor contracts to ensure fair wages. Created a council that included representatives from every rank, not just the highborn. And she'd done it all while raising his children as if they'd been born from her own body, loving them with a fierce devotion that made Silas's chest ache every time he witnessed it. You're staring again, Lyra said without turning around, amusement coloring her voice. It's becoming a habit, Alpha. Silas, he corrected automatically. They'd been having this argument for 6 months. She still defaulted to his title when she was nervous or uncertain, and he'd made it his mission to hear his name in her voice as often as possible. And I'm allowed to admire my Luna. She turned, and the moonlight caught her face, still thin, still marked by years of hardship, but softened now by regular meals and laughter and the absence of constant fear. The crown sat in their bedroom, brought out only for ceremonies, but she didn't need it. The silver in her hair seemed to glow with its own inner light these days. The children are finally asleep, she said, brushing dirt from her hands. Leo made me read the wolf and moon story 3 times. He's memorized it by now, but he says it doesn't count unless I'm the one telling it. He's not wrong. Silas closed the distance between them, drawn by something that had been building for months. Not the instant mate bond the legends spoke of, but something slower and perhaps more precious. A choice they made every morning to keep choosing each other. Dance with me. There's no music. But she was already stepping into his arms, fitting against him like she'd been designed for exactly this space. We'll make our own. They moved in the moonlight, swaying to a rhythm only they could hear. No formal steps, no ceremony. Just two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of grief and duty and impossible circumstances. Lyra's head rested against his chest, and Silas felt something in him finally settle, a restlessness he'd carried since Alara's death finally quieting. Do you ever regret it? Lyra asked softly. Choosing this? Choosing us? You could have had someone proper. Someone the pack approved of without question. Silas pulled back enough to meet her eyes. I regret almost choosing wrong. I regret every moment I wasted on duty when my children were drowning. But choosing you, choosing this family we've built? That's the first thing I've done right in years. We're not fated mates. She said it like a confession, something she'd been holding back. The moon goddess didn't design us for each other. We don't have that bond the old stories promise. No, Silas agreed, tucking a strand of silver hair behind her ear. We have something better. We have choice. Every single day, I wake up and choose you. Choose us. Choose this life we're building together. Fate is passive, Lyra. What we have. We earned this. We fought for it. We chose it despite every obstacle in our way. Her eyes filled with tears that caught the moonlight. I choose you too. Every day. Even when Elder Miriam lectures me about protocol and the visiting alphas look at me like I'm an imposter. I choose this. Choose you and Leo and Lyanna, 1,000 times over. He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, tasting salt and roses and the particular sweetness of something freely given rather than fated. When they broke apart, Lyra was smiling that radiant smile that transformed her entire being. They're watching from the window again, she murmured against his lips. Silas glanced up and saw two golden heads pressed against the nursery glass, his children spying on their parents with unconcealed delight. He waved, and they waved back frantically before dissolving into giggles he could hear even from the garden. We should probably establish boundaries about bedtime, Lyra said, but she was laughing too. Tomorrow, Silas decided, pulling her back into the dance. Tonight, let them see that adults who love each other dance in moonlight and choose each other every day and build families not from fate but from fierce, deliberate devotion. You're getting poetic in your old age. You're a terrible influence on me. Good. She kissed him again, brief and sweet. Someone needs to teach the great Alpha Silas Vane that strength isn't just battle scars and strategy. Sometimes it's knowing when to kneel, when to listen, when to let your children crown an Omega and trust that they see something you've missed. Above them, the moon watched over a pack that had learned that worthiness couldn't be measured by rank, that love was something you chose rather than something that chose you, and that sometimes the most powerful bonds were forged not in destiny but in the daily decision to keep showing up for each other. The Ironclaw pack had found its heart again. Not in political alliances or ancient bloodlines, but in a widowed Alpha, an Omega Luna, and two golden-haired children who'd understood before anyone else that family wasn't about fate. It was about choice. And they chose each other every single day.